Now we find ourselves in the 1940s, and of course this is the decade, at least until 1945, that the United States was engaged in World War II, and we are discussing how African Americans were situated during this period. And you probably noticed we've been moving almost decade by decade towards the civil rights movement, which will finally pick up traction by the 1950s. But one thing that should be clear here is this, and I want students to realize this. The civil rights movement just didn't begin in the 1950s all of a sudden. It should be clear to you that our discussion of agency and so forth, even the Great Migrations as being a political act, it should be clear that, the civil rights movement actually was already underway. It just takes a while. From Jim Crow, it takes decades for it to actually gain traction. And indeed, we're coming close to that time period in this timeline whereby you see it finally able to gain traction, and that'll be right after World War II. But first, let's discuss World War II. Two things happened here that are very significant. First, you had the second Great Migration. We had already discussed the first, and there is parallelism here with the first and the second, insofar as it's going to be the availability of industrial jobs in the factories that are going to be available for African Americans from the South to migrate to the North and the Midwest and even the Southwest by this time. For example, Los Angeles. Here is where you're going to see the neighborhoods like South Los Angeles being occupied by African Americans. Still today, that region, much of it at least, is still traditionally African American. And it's because of the need for industrial labor, again, especially wartime industries. Many people are abroad fighting in the war, and therefore industries had to replenish their labor supply. So again, it leads to even more African Americans leaving the South. In fact, with the second Great Migration, you see 5 million African Americans migrate to the North and Midwest and Southwest. All right, another significant event during the 1940s and World War II was something called the Double V Campaign. Now, what does this refer to? After the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941, of course, the United States enters the war, and there was a heated debate in the African American community as to whether or not African Americans should support the war, should indeed enlist and fight against our enemies abroad, overseas. Why was this a contentious issue among African Americans? It's because of this. Our engagement in World War II, especially as it was pushed and propagandized during World War II, it was pushed as a campaign against fascism. Now, if you're not familiar with fascism, it's an ideology, a political ideology that basically negates freedom for the individual. Okay, it's all about the people following this so-called great leader, like Hitler, like Mussolini in Italy. And there's no dissent, no political resistance that's allowed, no freedom of speech, freedom of the press, none whatsoever in those areas. Otherwise, you'll be killed. And basically, lack of freedom. It seems to be the exact antithesis of what a democracy is about. Now, our campaign in World War II was advertised as a war against fascism, which means a war for freedom against those who are not for freedom. So look at this from the African American perspective. They're fully aware, of course, that they don't enjoy much or most of the freedoms in the United States. They are oppressed for racial reasons. So therefore, if we're going to fight a war against fascism, which is the enemy of freedom, why should you fight for, or excuse me, in the name of freedom when you don't have freedom at home? And by the way, this is similar to the Japanese Americans who would end up fighting as well. Okay, why should they fight when their families locked up in concentration camps at home? In any case, this was a big debate in the black community. And what was crystallized here during this debate was something called the Double V campaign. And here's what it is. It's basically this, two V's. The V stands for victory. And here are the two V's. Victory abroad against fascism. And the second V is victory at home against racism. So the whole idea behind the Double V campaign is that, yes, African Americans will fight against the enemies of freedom abroad, against fascism. But once that fight is over and once the troops return home and peace resumes, well, the fight will continue for their own freedom at home against their racial oppression, against their discrimination, against legal segregation, and what have you. So this became the rallying cry, if you will, with the African Americans involved during World War II. And you can see how, again, this is going to connect to the civil rights movement really gaining traction after World War II. So this brings us to the post-war era, right after World War II, and why that served as an opportune moment for the emergence of the civil rights movement, again, to pick up steam, to gain traction, so to speak. And I have to remind you once again that, the civil rights movement actually began way back with the NAACP, with Du Bois and Washington, and with the political acts of the Great Migration and so forth. But here is where we see it finally able to gain national headlines, to gain the attention of the nation, leading to changes. And specifically, the civil rights movement at this juncture in its history will attempt to restore life into those dead letters of the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment. It will certainly lead to the collapse of Jim Crow segregation. One thing to recognize about the civil rights movement is that it's mostly a grassroots movement. And grassroots basically means it's not from the top down, meaning, the leading politicians at the time or even the federal government. No, it's happening from the bottom and moving up, meaning everyday people like you and me, everyday citizens, taking action and activism into their own hands, pounding the pavement, so to speak, engaging in protest, which will lead to one of the greatest social revolutions that happens during the modern era. Of course, that's the civil rights movement in the United States. A good way to look at the civil rights movement is that it's the second Reconstruction, or perhaps Reconstruction Part 2, because as we discussed, the first Reconstruction failed, but the civil rights movement began right after the failure of Reconstruction and with the emergence of Jim Crow, as we now know. Now, why is it that the post-war era was indeed an opportune moment for the emergence of the civil rights movement? Well, we had already discussed this, the Double V campaign, and with the returning African-American veterans from the war. Well, this is kind of similar to World War I, where you see African-Americans returning and realizing the fact that in Europe there was no as deep-seated hatred as there is in the United States. There is no de facto or de jure segregation there. They were openly involved with romantic relationships with European women, particularly French women, and no one actually looked twice. Okay, it was just considered not a big deal, only to return home. And sadly enough, occasionally a returning veteran, African-American veteran from the war, on his way home to, let's say, his small town in the South, he's dressed in his Army or Navy uniform, and he would be lynched upon returning home because he's supposedly a quote-unquote uppity Negro, right? Just because he's wearing a uniform. It's sad, that you fought the war, you survived, only to return home and be murdered by a fellow American. Okay, so again, why this opportune moment? Well, the Double V campaign was a real thing. Victory against racism at home. And this became the focus of the African American community at large. Secondly, as I described, fascism was the enemy of freedom. And as it turned out, fascism is embedded in racist ideology. For example, think about how race figured prominently in the Aryan ideology of Nazi Germany, that they were the supposed supreme race, the superior race, and everyone below them was inferior. In fact, it led to one race, that is to say the Aryan race, trying to eradicate another race, the Jewish race. That's why you had the Nazi Holocaust. Of course, it involved other people deemed inferior, like Slavics and so forth. So race figured prominently in World War II in fascism, and therefore there was this widespread, in fact, pretty much becoming a global awareness that racism is something that needs to be dealt with. And of course, that was true in the United States post-World War II, with the recognition of the connection of race and racism with World War II and fascism. Now, the next factor is the emergence of the black middle class by the 1950s and 60s. So with Jim Crow and the Great Migrations, it's going to take a while for African Americans to attain that upward mobility and to become members of the middle class in larger numbers, that is. But certainly you see that happening by the 1950s. And this is going to be important because they're going to serve as the face of the civil rights movement. That is when you're going to see TV footage and photographs of protesters. What you're going to see is the middle class, African American, well-dressed, respectable folks just marching and not responding with violence when violence is indeed visited upon them. Okay, and because they're respectable and the middle class and they're churchgoers, church worshipers and everything, well, this is going to affect public opinion, broadly speaking, in America regarding civil rights protesters. Okay, another thing that I just connected it with was the television. The television becomes widespread by the 1950s, becomes a part of every living room by the 50s and 60s especially, and therefore everyone watched the national news that would broadcast. This is a period when there was only 3 channels, okay, in television, and that meant that any coverage of the civil rights movement would be broadcast, and the broad mass of the American population would get a glimpse of the civil rights movement, and they would see the extent to which Southerners who supported Jim Crow committed these despicable acts like violence against elderly people and the fire department hosing down children and respectable people marching and so on and so forth. They would, in other words, get a direct glimpse of the evil, if you will, of Jim Crow. The extent to which Southerners who supported Jim Crow, and most of them did, to be frank, the extent to which they would demonstrate their hostility and animosity and acrimony that they cast towards African Americans in the South. And again, this would greatly influence public opinion.